Afternoon, and welcome to Inside National Security by the National Security Academy. I'm Haleigh Horan, and today I am joined with Bryan Mabry. And on behalf of In Network, I'd like to thank you for taking the time to speak with me today about your career and the future of national security. So, to start off, would you mind providing our listeners with a brief overview of your background, such as how you got here, the various roles that you've held, and then we can dive deeper into each of these different aspects as we continue throughout the podcast?
Sure. No, firstly, thank you for having me and for the chance to get to chat. Yes, Bryan Mabry. I spent my first just under 14 years of my career in CIA. I worked predominantly in the global response staff, which is one of the special operations elements that's largely tasked with providing protection of agency personnel in either conflict or denied areas. So I spent the predominant part of my career doing that. Later became a plans officer, so got a little more focused on organizational budget and resource management, and then left in 2015, went to the private sector, worked for a large defense contractor for about 3.5 years, and returned to government in the foreign aid side of the house firstly as the deputy assistant secretary or deputy vice president in MCC terms, and then ultimately as the CFO of Millennium Challenge Corporation, which is a smaller foreign aid agency that focuses a lot on infrastructure projects. Left in 2019, and since then have been working in the private sector in a couple different capacities as an investor on the private equity and venture side, usually focused on companies that are in the dual use space, so serving both a commercial and a national security application, and then also working in operating roles in some early stage companies that are focused in that as well. And I presently serve as Senior Vice President at Foxtrot, working in the AI implementation space.
Yeah, well, clearly you've had a lot of different experiences and had a lot of different places to see how things operate. What I think is really interesting is the segues that you've had between, working for the government and then working for the private sector. What from those transitions have you relearned, or learned skill-wise that can be transferable or non-transferable between each of these sectors?
Yeah, I think when I first left government, I had this perception that the private sector is this big sort of scary, fast-moving place that only everyone is going to be constantly trying to eat your lunch, and it's very quick-paced, outcome-based. But the reality is that large corporations and large organizations have their own bureaucracies, and so I think that was a bit of more of a stark realization than I had anticipated. The ability to sort of make decisions with limited or lacking information that comes from a lot of the sort of expeditionary government type roles, I think is also super helpful in the private sector as well. And you always want to have as much information as possible, but the reality is that there will always be fractional or missing pieces in that. So those are skills that I think translated across well. As far as relearning it, I think just sort of reframing that, the government, you obviously have to be a good steward of your resources, but at the end of the day, your stockholders aren't going to come screaming if you don't, move the stock needle or generate revenue, as long as you're accomplishing your mission. And so resource management is important in both verticals for sure, but it takes a different form. So I think that was one of the things that took a little bit of time to sort of just reframe how I thought about those.
Yeah, and with taking in that information, like you said, there's always going to be so much coming in, or, you might not have everything that you need. So what was probably like the hardest part on each side of those fields to kind of decipher and use and know when it's applicable, when it's not, kind of et cetera on that?
Yeah, I think on the government side, having the knowledge gaps, might take the form of, if you're operating in a war zone, obviously there's, different types of information flows coming in. You want to have as much intelligence as you possibly can from, the myriad of ints, all the flavors that you possibly can to leverage to accomplish, your mission in that regard. access to those is not dissimilar to the private sector in the sense that there's a finite amount of those resources, and there are elements competing for those. And so, a parallel example I think in the private sector would be simply, you can't bid or chase every opportunity as a company. So, having a judicious process whereby you're evaluating and qualifying an opportunity is exactly the general sort of mindset you would take to evaluating or preparing for an operation of do we go or no go, whatever this objective is, be it bidding on a new contract in the private sector or conducting some sort of operational requirement. And there's also the times I think that are applicable in both, where maybe you've done all the diligence, all the research, come to this well-informed decision, and someone says, "Great, noted, you're doing it anyway." And so, being able to move on and move out in that regard to be able to execute whatever that requirement is. I want to say, in spite of perhaps your hesitancy in that, or your opinion to the contrary, is also something that was really I think is universally applicable.
Yeah, I think decision making is, not overlooked, but kind of a skill that does take time to hone in on and develop. And I think a lot of people overlook that aspect of it. And with that, how do you feel, from your first position you ever held to now, how has your decision making strategy evolved as you've moved through the different positions, but also with the different sectors as well?
I think, when you're, at least in my case, when you're new and whatever the role is, even, you want to, you always, of course, want to set a great first impression, and you want to put your best foot forward and all the other, proverbial cliches that everyone says when you're starting something new. But I think there's also, to steal another overly used phrase from special operations, is fail fast. And so I think, failing fast is a different mindset that I've sort of grown into. And one of the things that particularly struck me, you just made a perfect reference to it, was the sort of the decisiveness and the decision making as an attribute. It seems something that would be sort of common sense or rudimentary in the way that one handles whatever challenge or assignment that is. But one of the things that struck me when I came to the private sector was how, I genuinely had someone in a meeting once comment to me like, "Well, it's so great to have you here because you're decisive." And I was kind of like, as opposed to what? Like doing absolutely nothing? Like, are we allowed to do that? I didn't know. And so it was really interesting to kind of have that perspective shift in that was an actual attribute that I just considered to be part of the way that everyone does business all day, every day, because I'd spent 14 years in that environment. It was an eye-opening thing for me in that regard to kind of think about that differently. And so, it's not a superpower, but it was an attribute that stuck out in that context.
I think especially nowadays with at least my generation at times, I feel like we're not very decisive. We eventually reach that conclusion, but some people are more, they have to have all the facts. They have to really plan out everything. So my dad is very much so of like, no, this is what's happening. Like, this is when we're doing it. Like, that's just how it always has been. So I kind of relate in that sense of knowing that, there's some people that just don't have that skill set. Um, and
And
what
you won't always have the right answer, right? Like, and you won't always make the right decision, but being able to, fail fast or pivot in that scenario is I think really the skill. And I use the example. I was speaking to someone the other day around a contracting opportunity, and I was talking about kind of, you could have done all the things right. You can be as well prepared, have the best solution, be all the way down the path for a contract award with the government, and then something like Doge happens, and all of a sudden you don't have a contract. And so there's arguably nothing you could have done in that context other than have a diversified portfolio of government and non-government things to mitigate that. But so, being able to pivot quickly in any scenario is I think really the key to success and frankly the key to survivability of a business or an individual in certain circumstances. So I think that um, you may never be comfortable making decisions in a less than ideal space, but I always I tell people as well, and I'm sure you've heard the phrase. It's like you know don't let perfect be the enemy of good enough. Like, and then I tell this like to companies that have engineering and manufacturing, and they want to tinker and refine, and they want it to be perfect. Well, you have to sell it at some point, or you're not going to have any revenue, and subsequently, you're not going to have a company. And so, um, putting your best foot forward in a way that ensures safety and all of that, but also ensuring that you actually have a chance to show the world the great, amazing thing that you were building because you didn't run out of runway along the way.
Right. I think that's the beautiful thing about, the government and the private sector. It kind of does show their opposites there of like decision making in the government is drastically different than what you can do in the public sector or the private
Absolutely.
sector. You can take some time, like if you're at a different like corporation like Google or, Apple, whatever the case may be, but then you're within the government and it's like, well, we have about 10 minutes for you to figure out what the best approach is here and we'll just run with it. And it's like you said, the adaptability is another great asset to have in your wheelhouse of, can you adapt quickly? Like say that wasn't the best thing and you did fail fast. Like now what? And so I think that's a great segue into, your work with global risk and also decision making. What I think you've alluded to it a little bit, but is there a specific pattern or set of patterns that you've seen across different organizations or, corporations that leads them to fall into a pattern of maybe not having quick decision making skills or something along those lines, especially with global risk?
Yeah, I think the sort of crass phrase of analysis paralysis, is a real thing, and I think that there's reckless abandon where you just go charging into a decision or execution of something with no information. I think everyone would argue that's less than ideal. It can't always be avoided, but that shouldn't be your go-to setting, at least in my humble opinion. On the risk management side and the sort of you know global perspective with that, I think it's a bit of a hybrid of the classic sort of risk matrix theory of risk versus probability. So is it likely that I walk out of the front of my house and get hit by a school bus? Hopefully, probably not, but it's also a severe impact if I do. So weighing that out as a corporate entity, in banks, for example, or as they're weighing out, there's the simple normal protocols of sort of the KYC to know your customer. Am I evaluating, if you show up at my door with $400 million of investment that I have no real understanding of its origins, I obviously need to do my diligence on you and the pedigree of that money. And you can exhaust that to a point, but then at some point in time, you also are taking a little bit of it onto, you may run into a point of, I can't pull the thread any further. And you either need to make a risk-based decision as a investment institution of, am I willing to bring this money in and whatever comes with it? Or am I relatively, certain that it's clear of sanctions or it's not evading any sort of, or it's that sort of laundering side of it. And so a lot of times, like the work I had done was around that type of thing. And we always sort of use the anecdote of the type of work that, I am not a financial analyst and nor am I a ones and zeros sort of follow the money through the ether type person. But we try to sort of strive to capture everything that's not on the spreadsheet in a deal. And that, that could be, as simple as just sort of the personalities of the players involved, but it's less so about screening for, HR, Me Too type issues, which are all critically important, but it's more around if I'm working at the behest of a private equity firm or an investor that's going to buy a company, I want to look at the leadership team not just from a compliance risk or a propriety risk, but how these people worked in the past and what do people that have historically worked with them have to say about them. And I may be an absolute jerk, but a master at my job, and in that risk calculus, that may be acceptable to the investor in some instances. And so you try and create a picture of the full landscape to the best extent you can, and then that comes into that sort of intelligence gathering around that, and then piecing that together to present the most holistic view you can, appreciating that you're never going to have the full picture of everything in most instances. But then you can make an informed decision on that risk basis to say, am I more or less concerned that this person's going to be a disaster to work with versus wildly successful at this company? And so being able to sort of cobble that together is an important part of that. And then you overlay that with the financial folks doing their thing on the metrics, and that's how you kind of piece together these sort of larger deals.
Yeah, and I think within the economic sector, we're seeing a lot of this taking place right now. And so how have you seen it evolve with all the different facets that are coming into the economic sector? How are you seeing it evolve and change? And what can companies do, especially smaller companies that are trying to, get their footing? Uh, how does that work?
I think there's a couple different facets like that I'll touch on, and different. These are not all necessarily universally applicable, but I think on one hand you've got like on the fundraising side, and the company, a company that's seeking funding, whether that's venture capital or private equity, and that's typically a function of where the company is in their lifespan and in their growth profile. That has changed immensely, and that's driven by market trends in general. So I think historically, private equity has had a typical kind of 3 to 5 year time horizon expectation. So you invest your money into private equity firm X, and they're going to cycle through their fund's life of that, and you're going to expect some sort of ROE on your ROI on your investment in that rough time horizon. Venture capital now tends to steer more towards around 10 years, and so that's kind of a longer game for folks. And I think a lot of people, the market and tech in particular are evolving at such a pace that people are less comfortable placing bets in that, because I think it would be safe to say in 1990 a 10-year time horizon would not necessarily have seen anywhere close to the technological advancement that the same 10 years between 2015 and 2025 have seen. And AI is a perfect example of that. And so people that expect to have a quick turn, maybe you're going to have another Uber, maybe you're going to have another X or Meta, those types of things, but you're probably not going to have one singular giant unicorn opportunity. You're going to have a whole lot of smaller ones. And so the way people are investing and thinking about that timing is a lot different. And so the resources that follow that are behaving differently. And a lot of times you see funds now that are almost in some ways struggling to allocate funding in a not that there's not plenty of companies that need money or asking for money, but are struggling to allocate it in a time horizon that holds with what their investors signed up for, say 4 years ago. And so that's kind of a challenge in the investment space as well that is out there.
Yeah, I definitely think the landscape is, as you already just mentioned, it used to be this much. Now it's 10 years for venture capital. Um, it's like every other landscape. It's just consistently evolving. And I think, especially now, I think with events that are happening within the Strait of Hormuz, seeing that global impact and situations like that, even, the cyberspace realm is having an effect on economic institutions in of itself, but then institutions in their own economic capacity too. So I think it'll be interesting to see how all of that plays out, in the long run. Um, Kind of switching gears a little bit, going back to the other side of your career. Um, One thing that really stood out to me in your background is you've worked alongside a lot of individuals who come within the special forces or special operations background. So what mindset or approach stood out to you that differed from more of those traditional corporate environments when working with these individuals or just working with companies that, have them?
Yeah, I think it's so I think recently, and I'm also really involved in a number of nonprofits that kind of focus on that space and helping veterans, particularly with soft backgrounds transition. I think in industry as a whole, I'm going to make a number up, but I'll say I think really within the last like 4 to 5 years, sort of broader traditional corporate institutions have come to appreciate and understand the translatability of sort of a special operations mindset or an operator into a corporate role, whereby historically it's okay, well, you were a weapons sergeant in, special forces. Why would you be a good chief of staff at, Exxon? And so the reality is that sort of rapid problem solving, again, decisiveness with lacking information, comfort in ambiguity, or comfort in chaos, all of those things translate generally quite well to most any corporate entity, particularly at a higher executive level or a stressful level. You may lack some of the sort of historical financial modeling. I may not be an Excel ninja, but I can understand the problem you're trying to solve, and I can probably marshal the resources within the organization to address that. And so the translatability of that sort of problem solving mindset, I think, is probably the most prominent one. But also, I think there's a little bit of the sort of no fail aspect, and not that you don't fail, but that you fail and then you move again and you move again. And so being able to do that in the face of a challenging circumstance, whether that's some horrific deadline or some sort of conflict operation, they're not dissimilar. And I think being able to sort of remain calm in those environments, but also be able to quickly pivot and use what you have available to accomplish what it is that you need are skill sets that are really sort of directly translatable, and things that I think, frankly, folks that come from that background, at least in my circumstance, I just took that for granted. I thought everyone was probably fine in that environment, and so it's not that someone doesn't deserve a freak out every now and again, right? But when you see that as a sort of barometer of that, and one of the things though that sort of helped me put that in context, because I think at first, particularly when you've done hard things and then someone argues, well, this is a hard thing, it's hard to not sort of immediately be dismissive of that. But one of the things that I had to sort of reframe and helped me perhaps have a little more empathy in that regard is, well, everyone's worst day in their life is just that, right? And that is their only context. So, good on you if the worst day you ever have is somebody keys your car, relative to, oh, somebody got, blown up next to you. And so I hope that barometer remains for those people, and that there is that sort of piece of it. But there's also that necessary understanding from both sides of that coin of, I may be coming at a situation from a very different perspective. And, I gave the example of when I was back in government working on the foreign aid side. I was in a meeting that was somewhat contentious around travel, and it was about airfare and airfare class for government employees traveling. And everyone had an opinion, and everyone is sharing their opinion, solicited or otherwise. And it was the context. One comment was made of, well, and this person was not familiar with my background or where I had come from, and they said, well, you don't understand. We fly to foreign countries and we do really hard work when we get there. And I wasn't in any way trying to downplay the work of that organization, because they do amazing work and they do work very hard. But then putting that in context to someone who flies on a military cargo jet, goes to a hard place and does something ostensibly challenging, it's a bit of a know your audience from comparison. But I think being able to translate between those, meet other people where they are, but also diplomatically and articulately help someone else share a different perspective, and vice versa. Be willing to listen to someone else sharing theirs. That's a really incredibly valuable skill that frankly we need more of in the world, in all verticals.
Yeah, no, I think whenever these situations arise for myself, I think of like an iceberg, that whole uh picture that they put out there. It's like you only know this much about someone's background. Like you don't know everything about it. And I think that's something that's been great that I've seen within people from my family who have a military background of always remembering that, yeah, I hope the worst thing that you experience today is getting your car keyed or
Yes.
like um maybe lost a $10 bill. Like that's the worst thing that happens today. Okay, like that's great compared to what other people are doing out in the world. And I think that's something, the people with military background, they have such great perceptions because of what they've, whether it's good, bad, all the things in between. They bring that level of awareness that a lot of people don't have. And so it's great to see how they integrate, which I think is also another big issue, is integrating them into, different sectors after they do leave, whether they go into the government on the civilian side or, they go to the private sector. I think that is, a really interesting thing that they have to go through. And it's good to know that there's organizations that are bridging that gap for them. In your current role, you're focused on commercial business development. Um, where do you see these developments for businesses going? Where are you spending most of your time within, is it strategy, relationships? How is that landscape changing as well?
So yeah, for the role with Foxtrot, I spend, so just for context for folks who may not be as familiar, so Foxtrot Services, we're about 2.5 years old. Really sort of had the good fortune of some incredible growth in the last year and a half in particular. Really since getting off the ground, it's been pretty meteoric. And we really focus on, historically, the company was founded by former Palantir employees and really are focused around helping corporations and clients that are using Palantir Foundry or AIP or other additional sort of AI workflows to maximize those within their organization. And that might take the form of supply chain management or monitoring assets and risks on the front end of that. So for example, if I've got a downstream supply risk, I want to be able to see that before it's coming and I can adjust accordingly. But being able to connect up all of that organizational data across whatever that enterprise is into that system to be able to actually have it make informed decisions and be able to leverage that data across all of those different silos that are usually historically present in corporations. And so, that can be an aerospace company that wants to have, critical component visibility or production or asset relocation, or it could be a food company that wants to cut down, delivery times for, spoilage or restocking, as some sort of, traditional examples. But our engineers go in and they're able to take all of that data, configure it and clean it in a simplest term to be able to make it all consumable in one single pane of glass. And that might take the form of a dashboard or whatever the custom build is that allows employees and executives from all levels of the company to have constant visibility into real-time data and to be able to shape that. And so, across industries, AI is playing an exponentially increasing role in general operations of companies, and that can be everything from HR, documentation and management, to contract management, proposal bidding, all of those things. And so we're really focused on helping companies prepare for that. And a lot of our clients are already existing Palantir Foundry users, so we're helping them sort of maximize the utility of those platforms across their enterprise. And then we're also helping them continue to connect up and scope in new forms of data as they come online within their institutions and as those expand. And so I spend a lot of my time on relationships in that regard. And so, and I'll give the example of an ideal sort of typical client would be an enterprise company that's already using Palantir Foundry or some sort of large scale AI platform, and then being able to understand kind of their pain points, but also their growth trajectory and where they would like to go, where they'd like to expand that within their enterprise, and then helping them shape that. And then our engineering team would come in, scope that, and then help them side by side build and deliver that to that, and then be available to sort of subsequently help as that growth process ideally matures and expands within their company. I think there's a lot of sort of hype and you'll see various opinions of AI is going to take our jobs. I absolutely don't believe AI is going to take the jobs of humans. I think AI is going to challenge the job of humans that are not comfortable or capable at utilizing AI. And I think that corporations as a whole are not. I don't think they're necessarily hesitant to pursue that. I think they are trying to still understand how they leverage the existing historical expertise that they have within their workforce. But you can 10, 100, 1,000x that now by applying that sort of historical human expertise across these platforms. And that's really kind of what we're focused on helping companies do. More efficient, cost savings, greater scale, all of those things become sort of just intuitive as you apply these platforms. And so that's something that we're really excited about. And on the relationship side of that, it's really just like continuing to check in with people and continue to check in on the pulse of the markets. And you've got, obviously, I think I would challenge anyone to open a news feed on a daily basis and not see some sort of marquee headline from Palantir, Open, Anthropic, Google, any of these folks that are investing hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars into this space. Being able to help support companies through that journey is where we're really excited, and being able to help build out a usable expansion for them to be able to keep pace with what's being developed out there that is truly revolutionary, really, for business.
Yeah, I think, like you mentioned, the idea and the perceptions of AI are drastically different for, everybody, especially if you look at it from an age distribution level. Um, I have a lot of friends that are, rely on it for a lot and in ways that they shouldn't. But, I also think it does have those benefits, like you mentioned, of bringing what you have right now at this level on a human base and then projecting it 10,000 times that. I think it also helps you think outside of the box. I think it really does bring forward some changes to businesses that the human mind might just not have thought of at the time. Like it might 5, 7 years down the road, but right now it's very much so here, whereas we can integrate that into the processes and make us think more forward facing. A lot of the times we're right within our reach, and have that fear and hesitancy to go outside of that box. But I think it'll be really interesting to see, like you mentioned, every news headline has something integrated within it that has AI backing. And so it'll be really interesting to see how that, evolves over time.
Yeah, I think about it a lot in the same context of you and I are from the same hometown, right? And so I think we had a shared experience of being in a somewhat more isolated part of part of the state growing up. But I think about, I was very young as this was sort of coming online, but the dot-com boom, when that first happened, and the fiber, when the internet became, large scale, AOL became not the only thing, and it expanded into this household thing that everyone had. Our hometown was a railroad town, and all of the fiber was laid along the path of least resistance, which happened to be railroad tracks. And so having all of that flow through a small town in Southwest Virginia that arguably probably didn't know a lot about the dot-com boom, not to bash our origins, but I think that sort of ability to latch on to that and see that over the horizon trend as it's breaking. I think it's safe to say we're not over the horizon with AI. We're firmly in it at this point in time. But I think the companies that are able to lean into that, keep pace with it to the extent that anyone can keep pace with what it's doing, I think are the ones that will really take that sort of accelerated ride out of that. And it's kind of the same. You've got your early first movers, as you had AOL and all of that, but then you had Netscape, and then you had Google, and you had Yahoo, and so all of these sort of iconic names that are household givens at this point in time were all the sort of first, second movers in that context. And so companies that are doing the same now, I think, are really well positioned to be those sort of historical legacy fixtures going forward.
Yeah, and it's like you mentioned, like our hometown is very much so railroad, old time, like lots of older generational individuals. And I think what's been interesting to see, even just in my time, coming back from college and things like that, of seeing where we've evolved, but also seeing how long it's taken us to reach this point. And so I think I'm sure you've seen it too in visiting how much it has changed, but also knowing it's taken about 25, 30 years
Yes.
than
Yes.
like the bigger cities. So I think it'll be interesting to see how and or if we see Roanoke kind of delve into that AI sector of how do their businesses embrace that or do they push it away? We have the whole Google data center trying to come into the area and it's very much anti that. They just don't think it's a great idea. But then there's some on the younger realm that think it's a great idea. So I think um, it's a whole, global thing that we'll see evolve over time. But especially within the United States, with how diverse each state and every city is, it'll be interesting to see how AI plays a role. Um,
Absolutely.
yeah, and just to conclude with our podcast, I have one last question for you.
Sure.
With having so many different backgrounds and experiences for students or young professionals who are trying to enter spaces like national security or consulting or even strategic advising, what do you think is the most effective first step they can take, and what advice do you have on that?
Yeah, I think the most effective step is take the time to explore what networks are out there. So putting in a plug for IN, right? The IN network is an amazing opportunity, I think, for people in that sense. Organizations like NatSec Girl Squad, Young Professionals in Foreign Policy, for folks that are really kind of focused on policy or the intelligence community, getting involved in organizations like that, even if it's just to be, a silent reader of their distros of events that are going on, and thinking that through. But for me, I think the thing that's really most impactful, and the thing that I, at least personally, try to dedicate a serious amount of time to is networking and mentorship, and for people like yourself who are focused in this space and have chosen to pursue a career in that sector, having conversations, meeting people at events, but also doing the work to maintain that and keep that up historically. I mean, I think a lot of young people. I mean, I can think about INSA events and things like that. You'll see 300 or 400 people that might be there, and there's a speed networking session, but actually follow up with those people that you make those connections. INSA curates a great roster of national security executives of government and private sector. Those people wouldn't be there if they didn't genuinely care about the next generation, as it were. But that takes time, and so I think it's an effort on both ends. And I don't know. I was at a conference last week, and it was an investing side, and the founder of a PE firm made a comment. He said, I don't know of any person in the investing space that wouldn't tell you about a deal or help you talk through your deal if you're an executive or you're a founder selling your company. But he's like, they're not going to reach out to you. So I would give kind of the same context here. I think most people in either in sitting government executives, sometimes it's tougher, and it's tougher for a myriad of reasons. A lot of times, they're not the gatekeepers of their own schedule in some instances. And so being able to do that and have those conversations, but if they're at those events, take advantage and introduce yourself and make that connection. And similarly with people like myself that are in the private sector, reach out on LinkedIn, especially use your school's network. I mean, use your intelligence, networking, targeting skills, and find an in with someone. But then I would also encourage people that do that is put a thoughtful note together. Don't just throw a connection at someone on LinkedIn, and then say who you are, say why you're interested, and sometimes that goes into the depths of somebody's connection box on LinkedIn, and don't take that personally when it does. But putting together something thoughtful. I mean, I've had a number of people from JMU reach out to me with a thoughtful introduction that am now connected with, and have had multiple conversations and gone to speak at JMU, and that's all because a current student, he reached out with a thoughtful note, and I ended up chatting with him. And so that, I think it's really, do the work is the shortest version to do that, because it is work, but it's very worthwhile, and I think it's rewarding for both sides, being able to pay forward a little bit of the experience. And I wish that I had somebody to have reached out to when I was starting my agency career, and I really didn't. So I have always tried to make myself available later in life where I can be helpful.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for, sharing more about your background and providing that wonderful advice at the end there. It's been great being able to learn more about you and your background. And so, on behalf of In Network, I'd like to thank you again for taking the time to speak with me today. And I look forward to staying in touch.
Now, thank you so much for having me.
All right, thank you.